It is the second week of July 1863, and the United States is holding its breath. In Washington, D.C., the air is thick with a humid, suffocating summer storm, but inside the War Department's telegraph office, the atmosphere is even more oppressive. President Abraham Lincoln is pacing the wooden floorboards. His eyes are red-rimmed from severe lack of sleep, his tall, gaunt frame hunched over as he waits desperately for a single scrap of paper to come across the wire. News of the massive, bloody victory at Gettysburg has already swept the North. People are literally dancing in the streets of New York and Philadelphia. Church bells are ringing. The public thinks the war is finally over. But Abraham Lincoln isn't celebrating. He is staring at a massive wall map of the Potomac River, and he is physically shaking with a mix of profound grief and absolute, white-hot fury. He has just read a dispatch from his victorious commanding General George G. Meade, and instead of feeling relief, Lincoln looks at his Secretary of War and basically says, "He has no idea what he has just done. If I had gone up there myself, I could have ended this war today." Before we get into the details, if you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button and become a part of our community. It is July 4th, 1863. The smoke is still curling off the pulverized wheat fields and rocky hills of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The high water mark of the Confederacy has just violently ebbed away after the disastrous, bloody failure of Pickett's charge. Over 50,000 Americans are dead, wounded, or missing in the surrounding fields. General George Gordon Meade is the undeniable man of the hour. Just over a week ago, he was a relatively obscure corps commander. He was woken up in the dead of night by a messenger from Washington and told he was now in absolute command of the entire Army of the Potomac. 3 days later, he was fighting a massive, chaotic battle for the literal survival of the Republic. Meade represents the archetype of the cautious professional. He is a cold, highly academic topographical engineer with a notoriously short temper and a brilliant, sharp eye for defense. He has just spent 3 agonizing days standing like a stone wall against Robert E. Lee's best, most desperate punches. He has protected the northern states from invasion. He has successfully saved the Union soil. But here is the devastating thesis of this entire campaign. George Meade sees himself exclusively as a shield. He believes his primary, overriding job is to stop Robert E. Lee from winning the war. Abraham Lincoln, however, is desperately looking for a sword. Lincoln is sitting at his desk in the War Department, and he is looking at the cold, brutal math of the conflict. He realizes that for the very first time in 3 years of relentless bloodshed, the supposedly invincible Robert E. Lee isn't just retreating, he is completely shattered. Lee has lost nearly a third of his entire army. His officer corps is decimated. He is deep in enemy territory. He is hundreds of miles away from his supply bases in Virginia. Lincoln points a long, bony finger at the map of Pennsylvania and basically says, "Do not let him get away. If you crush him right now, in this moment, the rebellion dies tonight." But Meade is looking at his own bleeding, exhausted ranks. He is looking at his dead generals, his exhausted artillery horses, and his empty ammunition wagons. He looks at his battered men sleeping in the mud and basically says, "We have done enough. We have won the battle. We have driven the invader from our soil." Think about it. Imagine you are the President of the United States. You have spent years watching your generals hesitate, fail, and retreat. You have spent hundreds of thousands of lives and millions of dollars just to force this one, golden, fleeting opportunity into existence. And now, your commanding general is acting like he's playing a game of border patrol instead of fighting a war of annihilation. So here's the situation. On July 4th, while the northern states are erupting in massive Independence Day celebrations, George Meade issues a general order to the Army of the Potomac. He wants to congratulate his men for their incredible bravery. It is a standard, formal military address. But in the middle of this order, Meade writes a specific sentence that will seal his psychological fate in the eyes of his commander-in-chief. Meade writes that the Army must now make a final effort to drive from our soil every vestige of the presence of the invader. When this telegram reaches the War Department in Washington, Lincoln reads it, and he snaps. Lincoln's secretaries later recall that the president's face drops into a mask of pure, absolute despair. He paces the room, waving the telegram in the air, and he essentially screams, "Drive the invaders from our soil? My God, is that all? The whole country is our soil." This is the psychological friction that defines the entire rest of the war. Meade, being a tactical engineer, sees the border between Maryland and Pennsylvania as a physical, meaningful line. To Meade, if Lee's army is north of the Potomac River, the Union is in danger. If Lee's army is pushed back south into Virginia, the Union is safe. It is a deeply regional, incredibly limited mindset. Lincoln, the grand strategist, realizes that geography is completely irrelevant. Capturing the Confederate capital of Richmond doesn't matter. Pushing the enemy out of Pennsylvania doesn't matter. The only thing that keeps the Confederacy alive is the physical existence of the Army of Northern Virginia. As long as Robert E. Lee has an army in the field, the rebellion continues, the men keep dying, and the war drags on. Lincoln realizes right then, in that telegraph office, that George Meade completely misunderstands the assignment. The goal isn't to politely escort Robert E. Lee back to his own territory. The absolute goal is to trap him, surround him, and annihilate him. Lincoln sends a frantic, aggressively worded dispatch through his general-in-chief, Henry Halleck. He orders Meade to pursue Lee immediately and aggressively. He urges his commander, "You must not let the enemy escape. The destruction of Lee's army is your only objective." But Meade does not move immediately. He waits. He rests his men on July 4th. He rests them again on July 5th. He organizes his supply trains. He sends out cautious cavalry patrols. By the time Meade finally puts the massive Army of the Potomac into motion, Robert E. Lee has a terrifying, crucial head start. Lee is currently executing one of the most agonizing, miserable retreats in military history. On the night of July 4th, under the cover of a massive, blinding rainstorm, the Confederate Army begins its withdrawal toward the safety of the Potomac River. Lee has tasked General John D. Imboden with guarding the wagon train of the wounded. And it is a scene ripped straight out of a nightmare. The wagon train stretches for an astonishing 17 miles. It is filled with thousands of Confederate soldiers with shattered limbs, missing jaws, and horrific gut wounds. There is no anesthesia. There are very few bandages. The wagons are primitive, springless wooden carts moving over deeply rutted, rocky mountain roads in a torrential downpour. For days, the continuous, agonizing screams of the wounded men echo through the Pennsylvania mountains. Imboden later writes that he had to ride far away from the wagons just to maintain his own sanity, because the men were begging him to just shoot them and end their misery. But the horror of the wagon train is nothing compared to the geographical nightmare that awaits Robert E. Lee at the end of the road. Lee's plan is simple: march his army to the town of Williamsport, cross the Potomac River back into Virginia, and lick his wounds behind the safety of the Blue Ridge Mountains. But when the Confederate vanguard finally reaches Williamsport, they stop dead in their tracks. It has been raining incredibly hard, without pause, for days. The Potomac River, normally a calm, shallow crossing in the summer, has transformed into a raging, boiling torrent of violent brown water. It has crested its banks. The current is sweeping massive trees downstream like twigs. The water is completely, entirely impassable. And to make matters infinitely worse, a daring Union cavalry raid has swept in behind Lee and violently burned the only pontoon bridge the Confederates had left in the area. Imagine you are Robert E. Lee. You are standing on the muddy banks of a flooded river. You look across the raging water at the safety of Virginia, but you cannot reach it. You look behind you, and you know that a Union army of 80,000 angry, victorious men is slowly marching directly toward your back. You are completely out of artillery ammunition. You have thousands of wounded men screaming in wagons. Your men are starving, eating raw wheat from the fields just to survive. You are trapped. This is the act of God. Nature itself has literally built a massive wall of water to hand Abraham Lincoln the end of the Civil War on a silver platter. The trap is perfectly, flawlessly set. The anvil is the flooded Potomac River. All George Gordon Meade has to do is act as the hammer. Lincoln sees the weather reports. He knows the river is flooded. He realizes that this is the single greatest opportunity of his entire presidency. He paces the White House, looking at the ceiling, and basically says, "God has given him to us. The enemy is trapped. Strike him now." Here is the catch. Having a trapped enemy is only useful if you are actually willing to pull the trigger. The physical friction of moving an army of 80,000 men through the mud is incredible. Meade's pursuit is agonizingly, painfully slow. His men are marching through the same torrential rain, over the same ruined roads, dealing with the same destroyed bridges. Meade is moving cautiously, constantly terrified that Lee is going to suddenly turn around and launch a surprise counterattack from the woods. By July 11th, a full week after the Battle of Gettysburg ended, Meade finally arrives at Williamsport and successfully pins the Confederate army against the flooded river. Lincoln is ecstatic. He sends telegraph after telegraph, begging, pleading, and ordering Meade to launch a massive, overwhelming attack immediately. But Meade arrives at the front lines, looks through his field glasses, and his engineering instincts completely take over. Robert E. Lee is desperate, but he is not stupid. He knows he is trapped. So he orders his exhausted, starving men to dig. And they dig with the furious, terrifying energy of men who know they are about to die. They construct a massive, highly sophisticated, 6-mile-long line of defensive earthworks. They chop down trees, interlock the branches, and build impenetrable abatis. They place their remaining artillery in highly defensible, overlapping positions. Meade looks at these massive Confederate trenches and hesitates. He remembers the horrific slaughter of Union troops attacking trenches at Fredericksburg. He looks at his own corps commanders, and he realizes that launching a frontal assault against Robert E. Lee, even a wounded Robert E. Lee, could result in an absolute bloodbath. So, Meade does the one specific thing that makes Abraham Lincoln want to tear his own hair out. On the night of July 12th, with the enemy trapped against the river, Meade calls a council of war. He gathers his top generals in a cramped, damp tent. He spreads out the map, presents the situation, and essentially asks for a democratic vote. Should we attack the Confederate entrenchments tomorrow morning? Only 2 generals, James Wadsworth and Oliver Otis Howard, vote to attack immediately. The rest of the veteran commanders, including the highly respected John Sedgwick, vehemently vote to wait. They argue that they should spend a few days doing careful reconnaissance, probing the lines, and waiting for the river to recede. They vote for caution. When word of this delay reaches Washington, Lincoln is completely unglued. He throws the dispatch onto his desk and shouts to his advisors, "Generals in a council of war never fight." Lincoln understands a dark, fundamental reality of military leadership that Meade does not. When you ask 10 men to share the responsibility for a massive, bloody decision, they will almost always choose the safest, least decisive path. Great victories require a singular, ruthless will. And while Meade is sitting in a tent debating the finer points of tactical reconnaissance, Robert E. Lee is not wasting a single second. Lee realizes the river is slowly starting to drop, but he cannot wait. He orders his engineers to perform a miracle. The Confederates begin desperately tearing down old wooden warehouses, barns, and sheds in the town of Williamsport. They rip the timber apart and use it to build flimsy, makeshift pontoon boats. They tie them together with whatever rope they can find, creating a highly unstable, desperate bridge across the raging water. The clock is ticking. The hammer is hovering in the air. But the man holding the hammer is too busy calculating the angle of the swing to actually drop it. The climax of this agonizing psychological drama arrives on the dark, stormy night of July 13, 1863. After days of probing, delay, and reconnaissance, George Meade finally decides that he has enough information. He issues the orders to his corps commanders. The Army of the Potomac will launch a massive, coordinated, full-scale assault on the Confederate trenches at first light on the morning of July 14th. The Union soldiers wake up in the freezing mud. They load their Springfield rifles. They fix their bayonets. They form massive, imposing lines of battle in the heavy morning fog. The artillery fires a massive opening bombardment. The Union infantry gives a massive cheer and charges forward across the muddy fields, fully expecting to run into a solid wall of Confederate lead. They scramble up the dirt embankments. They leap over the wooden barricades and crash into the Confederate trenches. But they are attacking ghosts. The trenches are completely, utterly empty. During the pitch-black night of July 13th, under the cover of a massive thunderstorm that muffled the sound of their movement, Robert E. Lee had pulled off a logistical miracle. He had marched his entire army, tens of thousands of men, his surviving artillery, and his massive wagon train, across the flimsy, makeshift wooden bridge and through the treacherous, chest-deep river fords. By the time the Union Army charged the trenches, the Army of Northern Virginia was already safely on the southern bank of the Potomac River, marching back into the Shenandoah Valley. They had escaped the trap. When the telegraph arrives at the War Department announcing that Lee has successfully crossed the river, Abraham Lincoln is physically devastated. His secretary, John Hay, later records that the president looked as though he had been struck a physical blow. He slumps into his chair, crying openly, completely unable to contain his grief. He looks at his cabinet members and says, "We had them within our grasp. We had only to stretch forth our hands and they were ours. And nothing I could say or do could make the army move." Lincoln sits down at his desk. The grief transforms into a cold, highly articulate rage. He dips his pen into the inkwell and writes a blistering, incredibly harsh letter directly to General George Meade. He does not congratulate Meade for winning Gettysburg. Instead, he systematically tears apart Meade's entire military philosophy. He writes, "I do not believe you appreciate the magnitude of the misfortune involved in Lee's escape. He was within your easy grasp, and to have closed upon him would, in connection with our other late successes, have ended the war. As it is, the war will be prolonged indefinitely. Your golden opportunity is gone, and I am distressed immeasurably because of it. It is a devastating, career-ending reprimand. If Meade reads this letter, he will undoubtedly resign his command immediately." But then, Abraham Lincoln does something that perfectly defines his extraordinary, unmatched political and psychological genius. Lincoln reads the letter over. He looks at the harsh, unforgiving words. He takes a deep breath and lets the anger slowly drain out of him. He realizes that George Meade is a good, honorable man. He realizes that Meade was thrown into an impossible situation just 3 days before the biggest battle in the history of the continent, and that he fought bravely to save the country. Lincoln realizes that firing off a cruel, angry letter will not bring the flooded river back. It will not magically place Robert E. Lee back into the trap. It will only break the spirit of the general who currently holds the army together. So, Abraham Lincoln signs the letter. He folds it neatly. He writes the words "never sent," "never signed" on the outside of the envelope, and he places it quietly into his desk drawer, where it will remain hidden from the world until long after his assassination. The resolution of the Gettysburg campaign is an incredibly bitter pill for the Union to swallow. George Meade won the battle, but he fundamentally lost the psychological war. He proved that he could successfully defend the North, but he completely failed to understand that the true objective of the war was the total destruction of the enemy. Because of that failure, the American Civil War did not end in the summer of 1863. It would grind on for 2 more horrific, unimaginably bloody years. But in that dark moment of realization, Lincoln finally accepted a profound truth. He knew that the Army of the Potomac had the strength to win. They just needed a man who wasn't afraid to use it. Meade was a brilliant shield, but Lincoln knew he had to go west to find his sword. And waiting in the west, having just successfully captured the fortress city of Vicksburg, was a quiet, cigar-smoking general named Ulysses S. Grant. The stage was finally set for the ultimate bloody showdown.